Welcome to Trissels Mennonite Church. We gather this year to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the first permanent Mennonite meeting house to be built entirely by Virginians. Our church is not just a building. It is also the families who valued and practiced their Anabaptist beliefs down through the decades. We remember those who came before us and build on the past, striving to continue to grow and learn from the lessons they taught. Today we worship as a congregation in a church family, continuing the mission started 200 years ago. Named Trissels for the family of a local landowner active in the church, the 1 acre purchased from Abraham Neff and wife Catherine Alabaugh Neff for $15 included a stand of large oak trees and a graveyard. At the foot of the hill on Heiser Lane, looking up at the current church building and cemetery, Cedar Run flows across the foot of this picture. Standing there, we can see the top of the hill on which the graveyard sits today. Our cemetery began as a family graveyard. High on a windy hilltop, surrounded by oak trees, the small family cemetery became the sprawling rows of graves we see today. It is divided into 3 sections. Early families buried at Trissels included Alabaugh, Brock, Bull, Funk, Guile, Kaufman, Shank, Shaver, Showalter, and Trissel families. Furthest from the current church building is the newest cemetery section. The burials here are more recent, and it provides much room for additional graves. This section is the site of the first Trissels Church, and its land was exchanged for the field to the south of the graveyard, which was used to build the second Trissels building. Later it was repurchased to use as a cemetery. A plaque to mark the location of the first church building was laid by legal trustees Sam Shank, Norval Trumbo, and Mark Showalter Jr., after metal detectors were used to explore the field. In 1900, Timothy Showalter, 13 years, helped his father George's hired man to tear down the ceiling of the 1822 building. According to Charles Nair, on the inside it was ceilinged with unpainted boards, beautifully arched overhead. The first Trissels building served the congregation for 78 years. It was deemed too small for district meetings. A larger gathering place was needed. Materials were saved to reuse to build a larger church. The middle section of the cemetery holds the oldest graves. Many burials in this section lie unmarked due to disintegrated tombstones, poor record keeping, or no markers set. The oldest graves were often marked with simple field stones. Our records indicate child burials often were unmarked. There are many children interred at Trissels. I did a rough count and found about 120 graves for children under 10 years, many unnamed infants. Some died at childbirth. Diseases like diphtheria, influenza, consumption, and scarlet fever were common. Childhood accidents could be fatal. A large area of the middle section is marked unknown in our records because just a depression in the soil indicated the presence of a grave. Trissels' oldest recorded grave belongs to Margaret Huber Burkholder, wife of Peter Burkholder. She died in 1798 and was buried on the Burkholder farm. The original stone was marked with M.B. and is located at the Valley Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center in Harrisonburg. In 1979, the current tombstone was placed in the Trissels Cemetery by her descendants. On June 2, 1892, Noah Spitzer sold land on the south side of the cemetery to Jacob Pfeiffer and the trustees of Trissels for the sum of $20. In 1900, Jacob Pfeiffer and wife Frances gave additional land for building the second Trissels. Built in 1900 using the foundation stones from the first church, it was torn down in 1950. The materials were sold and reused to build a house. Trissels people worshipped in the second church for 50 years. Because the church building was once surrounded by trees, Howard DeWitt Showalter, son of H.D.H. Showalter, remembered on the last cemetery walk the sweet taste of cherries picked from branches after church. A plaque commemorates the 1900 building. The cemetery grew toward the southwest, with the graves facing east. Once again, a larger building was deemed necessary to host district activities. The second church's location is marked by the gate opening in the fence. The step indicates the path worshippers took to enter the 1900 building. Howard Daniel Hercus Showalter, H.D.H., 1882 to 1969, attended services in all three church buildings. The closest section of the cemetery to the current church building holds those graves of the more recent church members or their families. These families include Burkholder, Showalter, Libby, Guile, Rhodes, Moyer, Turner, Raymer, Ennis, Shank, Falk, Strite, Miller, Trumbo, Kreider, and Bender. The cemetery gate, viewed in 1958. Clark Spitzer completed construction of the cemetery fence in 1959 and signed the corner post. For many years it remained an open space and was used for summer Bible school ball games. It continues to be used for Easter sunrise services. The ball games were moved to the furthest cemetery field. Most recent sunrise service on Easter morning in 2022. The closest cemetery section has graves that are aligned in straight rows, unlike the middle section where the graves are facing east. This was done to make mowing the graveyard easier. Our cemetery holds many stories. One rabbit trail I followed started with the graves of 5 Zirkle children: Delman, Elizabeth, Mary Caroline, Anderson, and Nancy Catherine. They died in the 1850s. What could I find out about these children buried at Trissels? Their father, Michael, was a saddler and lived near Linville, Virginia. Their oldest sister, Rachel Zirkle Good, also was buried at Trissels. She married John Good in 1870 at the age of 29. They had no children, and John died in 1893 from Bright's disease. He is buried at Trissels, and I discovered that John Good was the grandson of Reverend Daniel Good, who became a bishop here in 1837. His father, Jacob Good, also was buried at Trissels, along with 2 of Jacob's 3 wives. Rachel was a widow for 18 years, and she is listed as a servant on the 1900 census in the home of her sister Rebecca Rhodes. She died in 1911 and is buried beside her husband and near her 5 siblings. She was survived by 5 living siblings. Her mother had 11 children total. 6 are buried at Trissels. I wanted to share a few stories about early burials, starting with the Trissel family. The first Trissel in the Cedar Run area was David Trissel Sr., who married Martha Ann Showalter, a sister to our first Daniel Showalter. The Trissels purchased the land in 1811 from Peter Burkholder. David Sr. moved to Ohio, leaving his son Joseph as a major landowner in the Cedar Run area. Joseph's wife was Barbara Bear, whose grave is dated 1826, but the earliest Trissel grave belongs to their son, a child, David Trissel, age 8 months, who died 1823. There are 8 known of the Trissel family buried here. More recently, a gravestone was laid to mark the burial of 4 daughters of Joseph and Rebecca Paul Trissel. They died during the Civil War between November 19, 1862, and January 9, 1863. Elizabeth, Catherine, Martha, and Mary. A death certificate shows that Mary died of diphtheria, so perhaps that was the cause of all of their deaths. The parents moved to Missouri and did not return. Joseph Trissels Sr. lived for 41 years after his wife's death and was buried at the church in 1867. An early Cedar Run landowner, Christian Alibaugh, owned land here and married Catherine Showalter, a niece of our first Daniel Showalter. They had 10 children. Christian had a marked grave, 1842, at Trissels, and lived to be 91 years old. In 1823, his daughter Catherine Alibaugh Neff and her husband Abraham Neff sold 1 acre of land to build a meeting house that became Trissels Mennonite. The deed mentions a shared property line with Joseph Trissel. Christian Alibaugh's unmarried son Jacob is buried here along with Christian's son Michael's family. Michael died 1835 at the age of 38, and his wife Hannah lived 39 more years. This Alibaugh family had 3 children. Son William died 1825, 1 month, 6 days. Son Jacob died 1832, 4 months, 3 days. And son Christian died 1833, less than 1 year old, buried in the same row at Trissels. From the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Historic Pennsylvania Church and Town Records. In 1794, James Pennypacker married his brother John's widow, Elizabeth Showalter, daughter of our first Daniel Showalter, and a sister to Joseph Showalter. Elizabeth's son John, a saddle maker, married Mary Hiley and moved to Rockingham County, Virginia, where he died in 1835, age 40. He is buried at Trissels, along with his daughter Emmeline, who had died in 1831 at the age of 3. John's widow, Mary Hiley Pennypacker, settled up his affairs and wrote to her brother-in-law to take her back to Pennsylvania. He drove a line wagon down to Virginia and loaded up the widow and her 8 children with their effects and returned over the long and weary route to the north. When within 3 or 4 miles of home, the horses took fright and ran into the barnyard of Anthony Vanderbilt. When the wagon started up again, the widow was sitting on the back seat with her infant, Sarah J., in her arms, and the sudden jolt threw them under the wheel. She was instantly killed, but the child escaped unhurt. She was buried in Pennsylvania shortly after her husband in Virginia. Jacob Showalter, son of Joseph, married Elizabeth Bull. Elizabeth would leave her brothers. Jacob Bull died 1827, 9 months old, and Thompson Bull died 1839, 4 years old, buried at Trissels Cemetery when they moved to Franklin County, Indiana, along with her parents in 1855. 9 years later, Elizabeth's nephew, Americus Vespucci Bull, a Confederate soldier, was killed October 15, 1864, at Coots's store near Turleytown, Virginia, during Sheridan's raid, about 5 miles from here, and he is buried at Trissels alongside his mother, Maria Taylor. The 1816 burial of Margaret Showalter, wife of the first Daniel Showalter, occurred before the church was built, so the cemetery was being used as a community cemetery. At that time, church gatherings were being held in private homes. The first Daniel Showalter was buried here in the year Trissels was built, 1822. There are 8 Showalter generations buried at Trissels. Daniel Showalter moved to Rockingham County from Chester County, Pennsylvania in 1788 and built a home near the mouth of Cedar Run. Moab, son of Michael Showalter, was the 5th generation and last Showalter to live on this land. In 1792, Jacob Guile moved from Chester County, Pennsylvania, where he had been a neighbor to Daniel Showalter, and bought land beside him, which later became the home of Christian and Susanna Guile Funk, who are buried at Trissels. Their unique tombstones have German inscriptions. John Guile, my third great-grandfather, lived with them in 1822, the year Trissels was built. He moved down from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, to live with his aunt and uncle. There are 5 infant graves, children of son Christian II and Francis Funk, buried beside Christian and Susanna Funk. Their daughter, Barbara Funk, at the age of 22, married Christian Brunk. They were married for 42 years, until she died at the age of 91 years. They both lived to see their 11 children full grown, with 10 still living according to the Herald of Truth in 1880 when Christian died. They are both buried at Trissels. The family planted the original stones and raised new markers. This drone recording of a never-before-seen view of Trissels Mennonite Church Cemetery was taken by John Owen Showalter. Acknowledgement needs to be given to several people for the current graveyard documentation. J. Mark Martin became interested in updating the Trissel records and walked the cemetery with the sexton, Preston Brown. Large numbers of the graves were unmarked, but Preston remembered many of the names because he was the one who dug the graves. Preston died in 1954. Janet Shank and Joyce Showalter used the records of J. Robert Swank and church records to compile an updated document in 1991. Lloyd Trissel also made some additions to the record. In January 1987, Donald Lohr took over the record keeping from Mark Showalter Jr. and used the drawings from the legal trustees to transfer data to blueprint drawings and computer format. He controls cemetery sales and maintains records today.